No kneading, stretching and folding, or any other method required for this sourdough bread, and you can make it in a Dutch oven or in a bread pan. Here's how to make it. The day before you want to bake the sourdough bread, take 25 grams of sourdough starter out of the fridge. Feed that 25 grams of water and 25 grams of bread flour. I'm making 2 loaves, so I'm doubling that feeding, with 50 grams of water and 50 grams of bread flour. Stir everything together and then mark the top of the starter with a rubber band so you can see how much it grows, and let it rise at room temperature until it doubles in size, which should take about 6 to 8 hours at room temperature. Could take less time or more time depending on the strength of your starter. When your starter is bubbly and doubled in size, it's ready to use in your dough. For 1 loaf of bread, add 350 grams of water to a mixing bowl, then 10 grams of salt, and 50 grams of that active sourdough starter. This is less starter than I have in my normal recipe because this dough is going to ferment overnight for a longer period of time. That's going to allow the gluten to develop naturally without any kneading, but we do need less starter in the dough or else it's going to overproof during the overnight rest. After you stir the starter and salt to dissolve, go ahead and add 475 grams of bread flour. This is the last ingredient that you'll need to add to the mixing bowl. With all the ingredients together in one spot, go ahead and get a spatula or a wooden spoon or something like that, and just stir the dough to combine. Your goal here is to fully incorporate the flour and the water together, getting rid of any dry clumps of flour. Normally during stretch and folds or in the kneading process, you would be able to work out some of those dry clumps, but you're not going to be kneading this at all, so get rid of all those dry clumps of flour now. Once you have a cohesive dough that looks something like this, go ahead and cover it up with a kitchen towel or a plate or something to block the airflow. And since you can easily bake this bread in a bread pan or a Dutch oven, I'm going to be making a second batch of dough that's exactly the same as the first one, just to show you how to bake this using 2 different methods. Okay, so once your dough is mixed, it should look like this. It's really flat and shaggy, and you're going to see just how much this dough will transform during its long overnight bulk fermentation, the first rise. So let this rise at room temperature overnight for 10 to 12 hours until it roughly doubles in size. And the next day, here is the transformation. This dough is completely full of air, more than doubled in size, really bubbly and puffy. A little bit dry on top. I could have prevented that by covering it with plastic wrap or something a little more airtight, but that's not going to be any problem at all. So once your dough is doubled like this, it's time for an easy shaping method. If you want to bake your sourdough bread in a Dutch oven, here's a really easy way to shape it. Get a standard sheet of parchment paper and sprinkle it with a bunch of bread flour. This will allow you to shape the dough right on top of the parchment paper. Generally, if you're less interested in touching sticky dough, more flour is better. If you don't really care, you can use a little bit less flour, that's fine. Once your parchment paper is dusted with flour, gently release the dough from the sides of the bowl with your hands like this. Once you've got the dough unstuck by going around the bowl at least one time around, you can flip the dough upside down over the parchment paper and just allow it to fall onto that floury surface. Then carefully position the dough in the center of the parchment paper if it's a little bit off center. Okay, to transform this dough into some kind of shape that looks intentional, just grab pieces of the dough from the bottom, stretch it up over the top, creating a seam in the top of the dough. You're just going to bring edges of the dough into the same spot over and over again, creating one seam that you can see meets at the top of the dough, just like I'm doing here. And at the end of shaping, your bread should look something like this. And the great part about this shaping technique is that you don't need to score the dough later. Your bread will naturally burst open in the oven somewhere along this seam. It's a natural weak point in the dough, so the bread will in theory burst open right here. Optionally, you can top your dough with a little bit of cornmeal or coarse whole grain flour. If you don't have any of that, you could just use more bread flour. The goal is to just get rid of any of that stickiness that is on top of the dough so that it doesn't stick to the towel while it's proofing. Cornmeal will also add a little bit of a different texture to the crust of the bread. Go ahead and cover this up with a kitchen towel and let it proof at room temperature for an hour and a half. After that, it should be ready to bake. If you want to bake this bread in a bread pan, here's what you do. It's almost even easier than the first method. Just get your bread pan, whether it's worn out or brand new, and add a little bit of oil to the pan. Olive oil or neutral oil is fine. And then just spread that around the sides and the bottom of the pan. Add a little optional cornmeal or coarse flour for an extra non-stick surface, and then just dump the dough right into the pan. You don't need to worry about which side is on top, which side is on bottom. There really isn't going to be much of a big difference. Just dump it into the pan, press it down a few times with a wet hand to kind of flatten the dough if there's any uneven spots, and then that's pretty much it. The dough is in the pan and it's ready to proof. You can add a little bit of cornmeal or anything else for some extra texture on the crust of your dough. And it's as simple as that. Your dough is ready to proof. So cover the dough up with a kitchen towel and let it rise at room temperature for an hour and a half or until the dough roughly reaches the top of the bread pan. 30 minutes before your dough is done proofing, preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit with a Dutch oven inside if you're using a Dutch oven. Then once the dough is fully proofed and the oven is preheated, take the towel off the dough and observe just how puffy and beautiful it is, in a rustic way. Then straight to the preheated Dutch oven. Take the lid off and carefully lower your dough inside with the parchment paper and all. You don't need to score this dough, so that's pretty much all you need to do. Just put it inside, cover up the top with the lid to trap the steam, and then bake this at 450 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes with the lid on. After 20 minutes, here's one of the best parts of sourdough baking, seeing that oven spring that you've been waiting patiently to see. You can see how this bread broke open along that seam mark on top in a really cool rustic way. You didn't need to score this at all, and it's going to burst open along that line. So put it back in the oven, continue baking for another 20 minutes at 450 until you've got a nice brown color that you're happy with. You could bake this longer or for even less time, depending on your tastes. Then for the bread pan bread, you see it's been rising for an hour and a half and it's reached the top of the pan. You can move this directly to the oven. I put this on the center rack of my oven, and since there's no lid to trap steam around this bread, I threw in about 5 ice cubes right under the bottom of the oven. That's going to provide steam during the bake. Bake at 450 degrees Fahrenheit for about 45 minutes or until your bread looks like this. Then let your bread cool for at least an hour on a wire rack. While you're waiting, listen to this crispy crust. Even with a crusty crust like I just showed you, this easy no-knead sourdough bread has a really soft interior. You'll see that in just a second. The bottom is looking pretty good too, and nice and hollow when I tap on it. Now let's check out the crumb shot. You should expect a more closed crumb when you make a truly no-knead sourdough bread like this, and I think that's fine. That's just the name of the game for this bread. If you want a more open crumb bread, I would try this other recipe up here. But as you can see, this bread is super soft. Despite the crust being so crusty and crispy on the outside, it's got a really soft, fluffy interior. This sourdough bread was absolutely delicious on its own and with a spread of butter, and it did have a noticeably tangy flavor. For those who like a tang to their sourdough bread, this is a recipe to try. Now for the one baked in a bread pan. This bread was fairly crusty on the outside, which would make it different than, say, a sandwich bread made with an enriched dough, like my sourdough sandwich bread recipe. If you do like soft breads like that, just know that this one was super soft and fluffy on the inside and easy to cut through with a quality bread knife. If you're a fan of plain white bread and making sandwiches with your sourdough, this is a really good recipe to use in a bread pan. The interior was fluffy, soft, and almost bubbly, but without any holes for stuff to fall through that you put on your sandwich. And I know that's what everyone's looking for when they're making a homemade sandwich bread. And with no kneading necessary and almost no shaping necessary whatsoever for the sandwich bread, you just put it right in the pan. This is a must try. Whether you plan to make this bread in a bread pan or in a Dutch oven, just go to the description for the written recipe, and I'll see you in the next video.